Well, that was a bit of an introduction. I've actually got to try and live up to that. Can I just say that my colleague, Professor David McGillivray, is also going to be speaking with me today. He's not getting off lightly. And as Mark has pointed out, we are both from the University of the West of Scotland, and you will see the banners around the room of some of the degree programmes that we've done jointly with ICD at the moment in international events and international music and international sport. So perhaps can just bring our presentation up here. And we also have taken on new PhD programmes in cultural diplomacy and on these topics and a wider range of topics in cultural heritage and digital diplomacy and sport diplomacy as well. And David and I are both Director of Studies on some of the PhD students. We have 3 of our PhD students here today, and we're meeting up with them, so that's good to have them on board too. If any of you would like to talk to us over the next few days about those opportunities, I know that Celine's there that is going to speak to us, that's fine. Okay, our topic for today is mega events, soft power, and the hijacking the event platform. Okay, so we're going to start off by looking at an overall concept of mega events in an international stage and the importance of these events as vehicles for cultural diplomacy in a globalizing world and how their interconnectedness and growing social consciousness around the globe has been making them attractive to people and governments and nation states to say, I think we should be trying to have one of these events. We're talking here about international sporting events as well as cultural events and how governments are using these to lend some sort of political value and being able to use these across the globe, whether that's to influence their place identity or brand identity, or perhaps to reinvent this, to create a change in the way that the world views them. This is increasingly being used in areas of human rights, a growing sustainability argument, that they're in environmental cases, and we'll talk on some of these as we go through. We've also looked at some of the possibilities that although we now talk about mega events as a very current phenomenon, that it's not a current phenomenon at all. If we look back to the sort of 1851 Great Exposition, then this was about a very public form of exchange of cultures. It might have taken us 3 months to travel around the globe with our trade and industry, but at the heart of that trade and industry and exchange was an exchange of culture. It was about an exchange of ideas and an exchange of understandings. And again, this is centuries old that we did this, and it's only now, of course, that we use it more for political means and for environmental and urban regeneration means. We start to see a much more instrumental use through the use of cultural goals, and this has intensified, probably starting with but commercialised in 1984 with the Los Angeles Olympics, was the first time that this was fully funded and made a profit and was seen by sponsors as a way of placing their products and market, influencing the market globally. So, how does this relate to soft power in diplomacy? So many of you know and have agreed and adopted Joseph Nye's soft power agenda, and saying that the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion is the way that we're increasingly looking at relationships around the world. That power is achieved when people and institutions or nation states accept authority over others as a way of as normal by way of culture, politics, or policy. And mega events in this environment are being used as part of that platform. We're sharing cultural values, we're presenting re-imaging. The case of Beijing Olympics was about trying to present a different view to the world. The case of Germany in the World Cup, it was we have a new image to the world that we want to show as friendly, etc. These events present a global spectacle, undoubtedly because of digital media these days that we're able to transmit globally, and through increasingly corporate packages of sponsorships and money, we're able to exchange values and opportunities for this that presents an element that says, sorry, that's not what I was trying to say. I'm trying to say that an element that was about the money and worth of these means that more people want to get involved in it, and so there's shaping that spectacle to the world that allows them to present power and influence of a certain power elite. Today we would like to argue about that power elite a little bit, and to say that we think that in cultural diplomacy terms it works in many forms. It's not just about a country or a nation, say, showing on a global scale how they want the world to see it, but also for that nation or for people that are spectating or other non-governmental actors to say, well, hang on a minute, we would like to challenge you on what you're doing in your country on human rights or in your policies for women, etc. But we'd also now, we're seeing another change, is that we'd like to challenge the event owners. So the IOC or FIFA, we're saying we're not accepting that corruption anymore. And actually, we're also seeing further shifts in that from sponsors putting pressure on them to change policies and human rights. And we'll talk a little bit that as we move on. I'm going to pass on to David. We're going to go between the two of us. And I should say that David is from that lovely introduction that Mark gave us. David is my co-author on many of the stuff we write. We write together. And so we both equally have a lot of work in this area.
Thank you, Gayle. We're doing we call this a tag team, so we are literally trying to move in and out of what we're doing. So Gayle's provided a bit of context for what mega sport events have done, and as we kind of know, we all kind of have a sense of what a mega sport event is, and we see it, and they become very high media attention on it. But I guess our role more recently has been to try to really offer a critique of these events, to understand how they operate, both their strengths, what they can do, but also their limits. And I think that's a key feature of the way we need to understand these events, because they are, in many respects, quite controversial. I'm going to just talk a little bit about the kind of bidding process for these events. So as it says here, international event bids are planned and organised in a fashion that provides a contextual opportunity. And what I mean by that is that nations choose how they would wish to use these events as they consider bids for them. So lots of nations have bid over the last 20, 30 years, but they've all looked to get something out of it for their own nation or city, if it's a city that's bidding for some of these events. And it allows nations to, as Giulianotti and Brannigan talk about here, adapt, innovate and manoeuvre to differentiate themselves from each other. So there's that opportunity to say, we're going to host this event in a way that allows us to project particular identities, to achieve certain goals, and do that within the limits of what the awarding bodies require, but to do it in such a way that you can actually secure value, real value. And that value might be as much about messages to others about what you want to be rather than what you necessarily are. So we've talked a little bit already about that idea of creating a new brand identity and generating some sort of change in international image. Now, that's not necessarily easy. It's not something that you can always plan. It's not always something you can control either in terms of how people receive that message. And I think later on we're going to talk a little bit about how difficult it is actually to have the messages you may wish to be delivered and be communicated via the vehicle of these events to actually be received in that way, because there are a number of factors that demonstrate the complexity of that task. But we do have a sense that many nations, Gayle's already mentioned a couple, Germany came out of the World Cup in 2006 in a really positive light, and it was a very intentional strategy to actually ensure that's the type of response that was generated through the whole design of the bid, right through the process of planning to the actual delivery of the event. And I've done a bit of research myself on the notion of the kind of large fan zone environments that you saw in Germany around the World Cup, which were open, attractive, festival-like in their atmosphere. And again, that was about come, join in, welcome, participate in this event. Not all events are like that, so there's a deliberate nature to that. South Africa World Cup, a reward for the entire African continent. The kind of focus of come here. South Africa had a bit of history of not winning some of these events, but it learned and then it was successful and really went on the basis of some sort of unity and solidarity that was being brought to the continent through the hosting of the event. Other features of the way that these events can work for soft power is just in terms of the They're a way to symbolically challenge the traditional global order, to change people's perceptions of perhaps a nation, a city in particular. But these are influencing politics, but they're also influenced by the political world and political environment within which they are hosted. So, the good example we'll talk about in a moment was Rio, which obviously has just hosted the Olympic Games, Brazil having previously hosted a World Cup. At the time when Rio bid for the Olympic Games, it was a powerhouse, an economic powerhouse. Politically, it was very influential in the world. Of course, by the time it came to deliver that World Cup, it was in a different environment, politically, economically. And so you are influenced by politics, you're influenced by economics, even although you may, in 2009, when Rio, for example, bid for the Games, it was in a very positive position in the world order, a BRIC nation really influencing things. So these are not without their challenges, if you like, in terms of bidding and winning them. I've talked a bit about that securing the positive impact on the nation's image, and that's undoubtedly a key feature of why you bid for these. But also that allow you to have a sort of strategic platform within which to project key ideas to audiences. I like what Mark said about dialogue, and increasingly the idea that you can just project on others without the others being involved in dialogue around about how they perceive, interpret, understand, I think is where we're seeing this moving towards, and I think that was an important point that was made. I'm just going to finish before I go on to Gayle, just to kind of re-emphasize this point about awarding bodies. So we've talked about governmental organisations, political organisations, and perhaps some non-governmental. Awarding bodies for mega events are non-state actors. Many people have a view that they are perhaps too unaccountable because of where they are located and how they are unelected. And so there are lots of issues in there. But if you're looking to win and succeed in hosting one of these events, then you have to persuade these bodies that your values, the way you're going to host their event is going to lead to success for the awarding body, not just for your nation, for your city, for example. So absolutely, those that bid try and address the kind of the values and the expectations of awarding bodies. So to meet their desire in some respects, some recent hosts have been very successful at suggesting that you actually need to host an event in this part of the world, because actually the development agenda is to share these events out more effectively. Previously, these events were held in only certain parts of the world, in the advanced liberal democracies of the world, for example, and clearly that's no longer the case. And the awarding bodies have kind of tried to go out into the world in a more developmental manner, creating some interesting issues for themselves as well as for those bidding for the events. So the idea of identifying themselves as representatives of the wider emerging territories or cultures, we've seen that over the last 15 to 20 years of mega events, that people have bid, nations have bid using quite sophisticated techniques, campaigning and lobbying techniques to reach out to delegates of the IOC who award the Olympic Games or FIFA who award the World Cup, to indicate that you must take this event to this part of the world. And we've seen then some successes in recent times. What we're going to do in the next 3 or 4 slides is just talk about some of those specific cases of how particular nations or cities have taken their bids out to awarding bodies in a particular way to try and reach the awarding body's main criteria. And I'm going to hand back to Gayle to take us through some of those.
Okay, so we're going to take you through 4 in a time zone and looking at some of the things that they've been doing and try to use cultural diplomacy. So you see that Beijing in 2008, that was really quite controversial at the time. There was a lot of questions about why we would award this to China when there was issues specifically about their environmental policies and about their human rights. And it really took a long time for the media to come round, maybe just 3 to 4 months before the games themselves. And then there was a change, quite a big change in the way that the media was promoting and talking about what was happening in Beijing. And interestingly, when they bid for the Olympics, one of the main things that they were talking about was changes in the environment, and the pollution and things were key detail. The athletes were saying they weren't going to go. And so one of the things they've been able to do post-games is to show that they have made substantial environmental changes and that it was a result of the games and how that's been useful. But the key thing that they promised in human rights improvements was, interestingly, only from what we'd call a non-state actor. So it was from the organising committee. This was a key part of the bid that went in that would address issues of human rights. Interestingly, that wasn't from the government point of view. That was from the organising committee, which is separate. And so they didn't have the government support to necessarily implement that. And whilst arguably there was some changes promoted to that, it wasn't necessarily all of it. And so the issues then become about what we see as a public diplomacy efforts. And that public diplomacy is when there is direct governmental involvement. I would try to argue that cultural diplomacy is when it's not the direct government involvement. So we started to see that you not only had to try to get audiences around the world backing with this, but you also had to have a host a backing of it. Citizens had to agree to it. So again, you started to see a change in saying we actually have to bring on our citizens and show that they're backing our support for that as well. Again, this new image of a new China was involved because we brought external PR agencies in to manage that rebranding, to manage that external image. And of course, again, an athlete backlash by saying, we're not going if you don't give us freedom of press to be able to say what we like. Because initially they went out saying every athlete had to sign a waiver that said, you will not talk about us to the press. They said, no, we're not going. So that was changed again. So there were these things that was changed in trying to deal with Olympic values. Then on to London 2012. London had quite a big job. By this stage, we were in the middle of a recession. Beijing had spent lots and lots of money on their opening ceremony. It was spectacular. The images around the world were wonderful. London were thinking, we can't match this. We have to say early on. Yet they were trying to reassert Britain's place in this world order, which had been falling down the soft power. Oops. Are you okay? Are you okay?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. It's okay. Right, I'll speed up because I'm clearly boring everybody that they're falling asleep and falling off their chairs. Right, okay, no more. You can ask questions, right? We'll do a Scottish jig. Right, moving swiftly on. So Britain's had its own problems of trying to be this powerhouse or colonial influence and trying to get away from that, but also reinvent and reassert itself as a key player in cultural diplomacy and the British values around the world. And so some of this was tied into Britain's image abroad and about a way of reinventing this, thematically about promoting British culture, but also about developing the UK economy, enhancing security, and again, reasserting the Olympic values. Rio, David's already said, by the time we get to Rio, everybody is, they're appealing for perhaps monetary donations to help rescue some of what was happening in Rio because they were this economic powerhouse when they bid for the Games, and suddenly that had changed. There is indeed a huge criticism of their human rights, of the poverty, and how we're displacing people from villages in order to make use of Athletes' Village. Rio were not alone in that. Every Olympic Games have done that for the past 30 years, but suddenly it becomes more of a human rights issue there. One of the things that they did, which was, I think, a very good way of showing it, was they presented a global map. And in the map of the world, they showed that Rio was missing. And they present a very emotional argument. And that was a change. Everybody else was about how much money they could put in, what they would do for developing countries. But their argument was quite simple. It's our turn. And they present a big gap in that area of the world. It's an emotional argument. It says, we haven't had the Games. And if the Games are to be used as a force for good, which many argue, then as a force for good, it's our turn. We deserve this to try to boost our economy, to try to help, to try to deal with the, issues of poverty. So it was a developmental tactic, that one in this case. Qatar, we move on to that. That's much more controversial for 2022. And David and I have written a couple of journal articles on this that I'm sure you could access if you're interested in this further. This was very much the World Cup bid and the Olympics bid that they made. very controversial, but saying, well, you know, issues of heat, issues of human rights, issues, all of these things, but they were very much on a soft power offensive in trying to bring, tying it into an international engagement strategy. They produced various policy documents that said there was direct investment in sport industry, hosting major sports events, elite sport development, and for the first time they used the phrase sport diplomacy. So we saw cultural diplomacy coming into all of these. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, why is sport really culture? But all of these are used as a key tool of cultural diplomacy. All of them have a cultural programme that's alongside, that's about education, it's about sport for development, that's about sport for change, about culture for change. And so this small state that was already making inroads into being an international partner, and an influential partner rather, in international security, and dealing with global social issues and peace, they were putting pressures on their neighbours to deal with women's rights, for example. This started as a strategy in 2001. I was at the Doha Asian Games, and part of that strategy was right from then was to get to London 2012 with their first female athlete. This was about putting pressure on the Qatari neighbours and saying, we will change our policies. We have changed our policy for women's rights, and so will you. Part of the issue, of course, is trying to develop and deal with issues of human rights. We're seeing now that many of the labour laws are being questioned, the fact that they still take visas, the employers take visas and passports off of immigrants when they come in, and that single employer is responsible for holding on to them until you leave. That has been challenged. Our own PhD student here, Nasir, is working for the government trying to make those changes in human rights. So these are key things that are being changed. And that outside pressure of people looking in that are saying, it's about public diplomacy efforts and you need to change these. So that pressure to change, although they would argue against this Western democratic view of neoliberalism and forcing them to do things, they also want a taste of what's seen as that golden chalice to achieve that and allow the changes that hosting an Olympics will do for them or a World Cup will do for them. It's not without its criticisms, and now the sponsors, Coca-Cola and Visa, are putting pressure on them, are putting pressure on FIFA to deal with the human rights issue in Qatar. Our argument is actually the sponsors should be putting pressure on FIFA to deal with things differently, to put them on the event organisers in awarding bodies. But the media rights and the money involved means that mostly the people that benefit are those awarding bodies rather than the nation itself. Anyway, I'm going to hand back to David, who's going to talk to you about soft power disempowerment and what that means.
I mean, the key thing that we're seeing now, we're interested in the media department, and one of the kind of key aspects of the media and large-scale events has been that a cosy relationship between official media and these events. So they've tended to act as a mechanism to promote certain messages for the bid organisers and committees. What we're seeing recently is some really interesting debates about this term that Brannigan and Guglielmotti have come up with called soft disempowerment, where actually potentially the extensive media attention actually leads to some negative, some reputational damage for those hosting events. And that actually doing so may not actually be nearly as positive as you hope. And I'm just going to talk about some things that are, and that's why we had this in the title of the presentation, a bit of work that's starting to look at the changes that newer forms of media have made to being able to communicate messages. So, as I said before, the sport events have been what the archetypal media events. So some colleagues, Diane and Katz, have talked about this idea of a media event, that they are staged events. World Cup, Olympics, these are staged events for media that allow you to communicate messages. And increasingly, broadcasters were able to control that narrative. So you were able to say what you wanted, have that communicate in large numbers to a captive audience, an audience sitting, listening, receiving, taking on board. The very nature of the sports, the contracts that you sign mean that you have these very official accredited media being quite restricted in what they're able to say as part of being an accredited media. But what we now see is that actually you have these unaccredited media. We're all media. Your media. Your phones are here today. You can be communicating. You can be sharing something about our presentation using the Twitter handles that I think we showed you at the start to say good, bad, indifferent. You can share that if you have a large enough network around the world. You know, that can go to other people. Increasingly, that's challenging mega event owners. That's challenging organisers because they actually can't control the narrative the way that they would have liked to control the narrative. We're all quite keen on saying, I'd like you just to hear it in this way. I don't want the media to report it slightly differently. And I think you're now seeing that that's becoming problematic for event owners. Now, personally, I think that there's good opportunity there because it holds to account organisers for what they're doing. It holds account nations and cities at times for what they're doing. And maybe in the human rights context, we'll be able to show how that's beginning to have some impact, I think. So you find it more difficult to control social media in particular because it seeps out. You can't bound it. You can't keep it down because people are able to share things. And we're going to kind of finish this part to talk about this idea of a disruptive digital diplomacy. So digital diplomacy, I think, is going to be a really interesting area as part of cultural diplomacy because ultimately you are now about eyeballs, getting eyeballs on messages, getting your message out, not just through broadcast media, through the more traditional channels, but out through broader social and new media. And so I think there's a need for what De Hoog's called digital diplomacy strategies or defensive public diplomacy. What happens in a crisis? What happens when things start to seep out and the world's media and the world's people become aware of something and start sharing concerns about your event, sharing concerns about your nation? How do you address that as part of an organising committee or as a part of trying to have a positive cultural diplomacy message? And you see these things coming together across media platforms. So broadcast media now interacts with new media. So broadcasters say something, new media responds. The second screen idea, where we all sit and watch television while we're also commenting upon it with friends, in other words, through our new media messages. And you see the quote from Burchill there, where traditional media are challenged to accommodate and compete with new media, the full realisation of technological potential is no longer solely the domain of broadcasters, activists, citizens and spectators are now also able to use the tools to sustain and mobilise public sentiment. So you may wish to communicate a message, but actually it may be the audience that actually communicates the message, and they may not communicate the message that you particularly wanted to have communicated. And the one example I was going to use was one from Sochi 2014, where there was a lot of criticism of control of media messages. Lots of criticism about in the event zones in and around Sochi, the inability to be in there if you weren't an accredited media person to tell maybe a different story. And there's a band, now famous, Pussy Riot, who they seized the Olympic platform. They hijacked, that's why again we've used that in the title, to get there and use their new media following to actually stage an event which actually got people's attention round about the rights of homosexuals in Russia and managed to promote that and get really extensive coverage. And that coverage then becomes part of mainstream media coverage. So now you have a tension, a to and fro between newer media and older media, which means that actually those that are organising, those that want to secure some positive diplomacy through their events have to now recognise. And actually you have to have the skill sets to understand how to work in that world and in that environment. And we think this is going to be a bigger issue as we move forward. And I'm just going to hand over to Gayle, who's going to conclude for us.
So in summing up then, we've said that cities and nations then we're seeing across the globe are utilising mega sports events to change perceptions of themselves. But at what cost are they doing that within this global public order, wider global order? For some, they're seeing it as a necessity, potentially Qatar, where they're saying the oil reserves are running out. We have to get into tourism. They like what Dubai has done. We've tried to, but realise that in order to compete in that market, then they have to compete on equal terms and they have to deal with issues such as human rights. So in one way, it's been used to perhaps merge global indicators of acceptance and tolerance, but also challenge other neighbours of these things too, without just being seen as a complete Western domination, because that's not what they want either. They often talk of they're the intermediary between when East meets the West. And yet, equally, we, and often, David and I often criticise in some of our articles that there's little evidence that bidding for or hosting a mega sport event provides the impetus to address the concerns over human rights and other social and social justice related issues. And so we like to use these platforms and challenge that to say we need to do more for human rights, and we need to actually, if these events can be used as a force for good, because we often hear that they are used for that, then how are they used for it? Where is the evidence that their social change actually takes place? Often we hear that there's an economic change that deals with issues of poverty, but what about the cultural change? What about a social change? And especially in areas of human rights. And then lastly then, just that public and cultural diplomacy efforts are contested in a disrupted digital space, that as we see more digitalisation around the globe from these events, that this is going to be contested. And it may undermine the message that was there in the first place. So I think there is the opportunity for us to use these as a force for good, but it needs more people to be questioning these large event owners who seem to have all the power. Okay, and that's it. Thank you very much.
And please do, if you have such a thing as a Twitter handle or otherwise, please do get in touch via Twitter and tell us something about it.
Does anybody want to ask any questions?
Exactly. Firstly, I would like to ask you, please join me one more time in a very warm gratitude to Professor Gayle McPherson and Professor David McGillivray.
Very good, very good.
I don't know if our mic's on. I don't think our mic's on. Radicina, the mic's not on.
Thanks for a really good presentation. I have a question. The one Olympic Games that you didn't mention were the 2004 Games in Athens, in Greece. And so my question is this. What, if any, positive outcomes, whether it be for the nation, the image of the nation, or for its economic development, or for that matter, its so-called reputation for human rights?
Very few. You know, I mean, there's no point in, I think definitely Gayle and I are not here to promote the value of these events, because that's actually the key challenge. There are far too many people promoting these events as a panacea, and they're clearly not. They are, the amount of building that Athens did, and clearly the economy has suffered significantly. Partly, many people would argue that that was a big feature, and if anyone's been in Athens and seen the stadia and the way of it, I mean, there are major issues there in terms of whether the legacy was positive. I think what you're finding is that there's a rejection of the gigantism of these events now, and I think the IOC, for example, will have to address that, because reputationally, they're going through huge issues, because people are no longer willing to, in the public purse, people are no longer willing to pay that. So a really interesting trend that we didn't mention is that, you know, there are now really effective groups mobilizing against the event bids in the first place. So, you know, in Boston pulled out of the a bid for 2024 Olympic Games, and then Hamburg pulled out, and the IOC is going to in a position where it could be left without very many candidates for these events, and that's because the public are saying, we know we now guarantee the cost for these events, and if you or I or anyone else had to pay extra taxes to guarantee the losses that may come from building lots of stadia, we would probably go, oh, we're not sure either. And I think now there's an accountability that comes from people know this. People, and actually new media and social media are promoting some of that people know there's a huge cost here. So I think you're going to find that in the next few years, there are going to be some interesting developments in terms of how do bids go together. Are you going to see joint bids? Are you going to see, there's even been debates about whether only 3 or 4 places will host the Olympic Games. Now, I don't think that might happen yet, but there at least is a debate taking place. So yeah, Athens was a disaster for potentially for Greece and for reputation in lots of ways.
We have questions.
Hello, my name is Linda. I'm a student at the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. Now, my question is very much related to what we've just been talking about. You've just talked about, and I very much agree, because the benefits of soft power and public diplomacy take a long time to be realized. And for countries that are developed, it's they can afford to do it because they are richer, so to speak. And so how would you advise, how would the developing countries, for example, South Africa, Brazil, how would they balance the investments versus return on investments on such mega sporting events, considering, for example, South Africa spent over $3 billion just for the sporting events, and an estimation shows that they spent about $13,000 per visitor. That's a lot of money for a developing country that's dealing with structural issues, poverty, mining rights issues. So how do they balance the...
Well, I'll start. I think they can only do so if there's a language now being used within mega event literature around about leveraging, and that leveraging means that you effectively plan resources 2 or 3 years in advance and build infrastructural developments, build social developments into the program, not just for the event, but because you were going to be doing that anyway, and the event potentially could be used to speed that up, to accelerate it. But because if you wait and try and do legacy the other way, i.e. after the event, that used to be the focus, legacy, and it will just happen. Legacy will happen, and actually then you spend lots of money without knowing what you're trying to achieve. So I think the potential is to build bids through a kind of leveraging strategy. But I would also just contest that rich countries are the only ones that can host these, because I think what you're finding is that the advanced liberal democracies of the West are actually not wanting to host, because the debate we had a minute ago, the public are no longer accepting of these bids because they realize they're going to cost a huge amount of money for them too. So I think the interesting challenge for awarding bodies is that they may have to award events to nations or to environments that they perhaps will get criticised for, because some of those nations are able to put more resource into it without the need for accountabilities in the same way as we have in some parts of the world. So I think you can do it by leveraging only, but then again, we both live in Glasgow, and Glasgow's a city as part of a country that's had a more incremental strategy around about events. So it's built infrastructures for smaller events all the way through, and then it's used those infrastructures to host slightly larger events. And I think that's also a more effective strategy.
Yeah, I think in short, it's about using it as a catalyst for change that you wanted to make anyway, and rather than that it's a panacea to solve all the social problems that you think it can solve. With what we call a Tier 2 mega event, like a Commonwealth Games, with Delhi having that, and then Glasgow next, partly there was a reaction to security issues or non-build or these type of things. But it was also a developmental opportunity. So sometimes there is an emotional argument, and then the next time it's a safe pair of hands of somewhere that could afford it. But South Africa, again, the idea was that this was a development opportunity. But again, that's maybe doesn't turn out like that. And David and I are quite critical on the event owners, again, the IOC, Commonwealth Games Federation. Commonwealth Games Federation, there tends to be more social development policies written into that they have to fund athletes from developing countries. There has to be a sports development plan of financial aid to developing countries to send for children's development or sports development, and then sending athletes. So there tends to be more social help built into those. It's supposed to be in the Olympics as well, but not necessarily, and certainly not with some of the big World Cups as well. But as David says, it's now I think people are waking up to maybe as a catalyst, leveraging it for change, but it doesn't always, the legacy issue doesn't always work. Okay.
Yeah, when you talked about raising awareness on human rights and homosexual rights and using those events as a catalyst, it came to my mind the example of Eurovision Song Contest, because it's very obvious. I mean, some songs are used directly as a message. Did you not consider studying Eurovision Song Contest?
I thought I wasn't dare get into the politics of the Eurovision Song Contest and whether or not there's block votes. I think we'd probably as academics, get ourselves hung on that one. So, people have asked me that before, actually. Would I look at the Eurovision Song Contest as a mega event? But it's a very different mega event. And
I think you'll find that there is a big study going on the Eurovision Song Contest, actually. So I've come across it, and if you see me after, we'll share it, because there is a large-scale study going on about that particular event. Thanks.
Oh, something else. Anyway, I think we should probably stop, because the next speaker should be coming on. Oh, okay, sorry.
Thank you. I'll make it quick. But first of all, I would love to read a paper about the Eurovision Song Contest as a mega event. But my question is going back to the role of the non-state actors, because we have seen a lot of groups mobilizing themselves to block mega events. But when the event has been won by a country, what strategies have you seen by the nation to win over their public? Because we've seen kind of mass protests in Brazil with regards to the World Cup and the Olympics. But for example, I'm not sure what it was like in the UK. So maybe can you explain what the strategies have been by some countries?
Well, I mean, the strategies tend to happen beforehand, Naomi. Because in order to win an Olympics, you have to show host city, host nation support, and you literally have to show physical evidence of that. So those strategies tend to be around things like they would be put in east end of cities, they would be dealt with for urban regeneration, it would be about new housing. More recently, it would be that the athletes' village are turned into social housing and private housing. There's venues that will be there and subsidised for sport afterwards, or culture, and some of these are there. Do you want to add to that?
Well, I think we talked about the sort of PR and marketing exercises that take place. I think they are actually used significantly post-bid as well, success, to actually get people to support the delivery and to support what's happening. And I think that model is quite effective for the organisers to get out positive. But it's a lot of that positive messaging that I think the public, in the broadest sense, haven't been that actively mobilised, I don't think, in the past, but I think now they're becoming more so. I'll give you an example of Glasgow, which hosted the Commonwealth Games, and broadly there wasn't a huge amount of critique, really, pre-bid about that event, but during the event, the people in the environments most heavily impacted were really furious, but the tactics were really kind of interesting around about notions of setting the agenda. So they held a number of public meetings, the agenda was very clearly defined and set out, and people sat in the audience but weren't really able to do that much beyond that. There's real challenge, I think, in groups who have got very different interests mobilising, and I think in London there's a great example of where there were lots of groups who were concerned, but they didn't really mobilise as an organised thing. They mobilised individually and did their own things, and actually, with the power of broadcast media and the power of the media behind the organisers, there was no chance really of making much difference. And there's a really interesting book by Christopher Shaw, who wrote about the Vancouver Olympics. He was involved in No Games Vancouver, so he was a very big proponent of no games before the event, and he talks quite interestingly about the difficulty of shifting the frame once you don't win that, once you don't prevent the bid from going ahead. You're in a very weakened position if you're an oppositional group, because you can't get access to the media in the same way. But I think that's changing a little bit, and I think that's where we're now seeing much more public discussion of some of these things. That I do think does hold them to account, organisers to account. They have to address those concerns more effectively. Okay.
Thank you very much one more time, and big round of applause for our dear guest from Western Scotland.